Welcome to the Vernuccio Novak Report and the American Political Zone. From New York, this is Frank Vernuccio.
And from Washington, this is Daria Novak.
And Daria, across the globe, we are hearing stories that finally some people from the World Health Organization are going to start taking a more intensive look at what happened in that laboratory in Wuhan, China. Now, there's a bit of intrigue here. It seems that the Biden State Department has taken off the State Department website a report that was done during the Trump administration talking about the violations and the dangers that occurred at that Wuhan laboratory that led to the pandemic that we're now suffering from.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of strange things happen. In the first days of the Biden administration, we also saw the removal from the website as China being identified as the most serious threat to the United States national security. I'm not, Frank, I told you off air, my name for this administration is, Biden is a pander bear. It seems that every time we look at something with China in the last few days, this administration, is working behind the scenes, it appears, to be covering up for whatever is happening in China. Now, this is not the first time that a virus has escaped in China. We know other labs that have released accidentally Ebola virus and things that are very serious. They're level 4 lab escapes. So, we can't be just ignorant. I just can't believe that we could be this ignorant and just say, oh, China is totally innocent. As you mentioned, the World Health Organization, notably one that supports China, has had high-ranked individuals from China within their organization. Even they are investigating what's been going on in the lab. Now, we're seeing, again, additional crackdowns internally in China on travel within the country. And some of the people in Wuhan, from what I understand, are starting to quietly talk about what the Chinese government is actually doing. Now, of course, we're talking about a very repressed society with very strict rules on what can and can be said. In fact, China is a society where there are rules that are set, that are internal regulations that are different than external regulations. And what that means is that the Chinese population, if they were to tell us about what's happening in Wuhan, they could be in trouble. And the United States or a foreigner individual talking to somebody in Wuhan would not even be aware of the regulation that they can't speak, because that in itself is hidden in China. So we're dealing with a society that's not very open, and one where, unfortunately, from friends that I've spoken to in the intelligence community, this is a society where they believe another virus or fungus or other types of chem bioweapons could be released by China in the future. I have not had one person tell me that this is over. I'd like to welcome Vincent Vernuccio, the president of the Institute for the American Worker and a senior fellow with the Mackinac Center, to the show today. Vincent, welcome to the show. I'm so glad you're here, and I have a question for you. I've been watching what's been going on in this administration, the Biden administration, during the first few days. It seems that there are thousands of Americans who are losing their jobs from decisions that have been made at the White House in this past week. What's going on?
I mean, you look at specifically like the Keystone Pipeline that just by executive fiat, President Biden is trying to kill, and the tens of thousands of jobs that are just instantly lost because of that decision. One thing to really focus on are the union jobs that are being lost. I mean, these are unions that support President Biden, that gave to President Biden, that went out, did door knocking, and helped elect him. And now it's like, well, you can just go find another job. Why don't you go make solar panels or something like that? It really is tone deaf, and he's harming the people that put him into office.
Those solar panels, which, by the way, are made in China, but that, I guess, is a different story altogether. You and the Institute have looked extensively at that kind of dichotomy between the decisions made by union leaders and the wishes of the union rank and file. Did you see that magnified during the last election?
Yeah, well, the Mackinac Center actually does have polling out, and it shows that typically 40% union members, give or take, on the election. And in President Trump's first election, he did very, very well with blue collar and union workers. And 40% of union workers usually vote Republican, but well over 90%, the vast majority of union political money and union political effort goes to Democrats. So there really is a disconnect between the rank and file union member and the leadership when it comes to politics.
There have been a number of labor disputes over the past couple of years that you wonder where they're going to go under the Biden administration. Talk to us a bit about the problem of independent contractors.
Well, that's something that the Trump Department of Labor put out in a rule that they put out, finalized in January, will hopefully go into effect in early March. And essentially what it said is that, you should have the American time-honored tradition to be your own boss. And it clarified who's an employee and the protections for those employees. But it also clarified and moved away from what we're seeing in California, this ABC test that essentially says that those working for themselves, independent contractors, freelance writers, artists, musicians, even people working in the gig economy, Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, that they are actually employees and they lose so much of their freedom and independence. And actually on the Institute for the American Workers website, i4aw.org, we actually have a series of people from California, independent workers from California, that were directly harmed by that law. Now, the Trump Department of Labor is trying to clarify away from what that says and make it easier to be an employee. But unfortunately, what we're going to probably see out of the Biden administration is they'll roll back that rule, not enforce it, or unfortunately go the other way and harm independent workers throughout the country using the same test that has harmed so many countless independent workers in California.
Another proposal we're hearing about that's coming out of Washington today is the $15 an hour minimum wage. I remember when this was tried in Seattle and we saw many restaurants close for these workers that were on the lower end of the wage scale. If a $15 an hour wage is a requirement across the country, what's that going to do to our economy?
Well, it's not just looking at the economy. The first people that I would say we need to look at are those entry-level workers. Essentially what you're doing is you're taking their first job away from them because they need to get experience. And frankly, the best way to get a raise on a job is not to raise the minimum wage, it's to get experience and work your way up, like many of us have done when we were young, getting experience and work your way up. Unfortunately, what we're going to see is consequences like those jurisdictions that have already raised the minimum wage to astronomically high levels. And I'd say $15 across the board across the country is pretty artificially high. And you're going to see that entry-level workers are going to be extremely harmed by it. That we're going to see more automation, and we are going to see a detrimental effect on the economy because of this artificial minimum wage and the raise that we're going to see, and essentially the number of 15 that basically has its origin in there's a great video of the person that came up with it, SEIU organizer, that said 10 is too low, 20 is too high, so hey, let's do 15. And that was the academic and economic thought that went into this $15 minimum wage.
Vincent, we seem to be going from one short-term solution to the other lately with this administration. And when I say lately, this is all within the last week or so. We're seeing changes that don't seem very logical when you talk about the economic health of this country. They're now debating on Capitol Hill a $1,400 payment to families. Now, while we all would love to have more money in our pocket, especially the people at the lower end of the economic scale, what is that going to do to the country economically in the long run?
I mean, right now, you're hearing about the hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars, depending on who's talking. I mean, debt is just getting worse and worse and worse, and that's what people really need to start thinking about. If people are hurting right now, the key is to get them back to work and not take away their jobs. And whether it is social distancing or quarantine or masks or measures to mitigate some of the dangers from COVID, which have to be there. That's in one bucket, but unfortunately what we're seeing direct attacks on jobs like the Keystone Pipeline for some radical environmental left-leaning concerns that are going to harm prosperity and harm jobs and, frankly, even harm the people that got President Biden elected into office.
On the Keystone Pipeline, most environmental specialists will tell you that certainly pumping oil or pumping any substance on a pipeline is a lot more fuel efficient and a lot less polluting than sending it by truck or by rail. Have you heard in any of your research what the real reason for this is? I mean, clearly from an environmental perspective, pumping is a lot better than rail or truck. So what is the environmental reason that the administration is giving for stopping this pipeline and laying off all these workers?
I'm more focused on the layoffs of the workers and the harm that's going to be laid upon these workers, not to mention the increased energy prices and all of that. But once again, these are, supposedly the people that supported President Biden. I don't think they expected him to go this way. And, you're even seeing not just from the pipeline perspective, but even from the coal miners' perspective. And this is why, people like Senator Manchin in West Virginia may be having to push back against their own party's president because it is so radical and it's harming jobs. And these union members that are paying dues, and those dues are being used for politics and supporting politicians like President Biden that are directly harming their jobs, they definitely deserve an explanation and maybe reconsider whether that is in their best long-term interest.
We're seeing something similar coming from workers in the Southwest as well, whose unions supported the Biden candidacy. When you talk about raising minimum wage, has the Biden administration, to your knowledge, done any research on what this is going to be doing to small businesses throughout the United States? The engine of economic recovery traditionally has been, in most cases, small businesses. And after the ravages of COVID-19, to put on them having a dramatic increase in minimum wage could well stop any attempts for recovery by them at all. Has any research been done by the Biden administration on that score?
Well, you have to go to the White House website for that. They're going to definitely.
I'm sure if we asked that question, Jen Psaki would say, "I'll get back to you," or "I'll circle back to you on that."
Yeah. But I mean, there is ample evidence out there that raising minimum wage does hurt entry-level workers and does prevent them from getting into the economy, getting that experience. And of course, we want everyone to get a raise. We want hard work to be rewarded. But unfortunately, when you prevent someone from getting that entry-level job, getting that experience, you have long-term effects that harm their ability to get those raises in the future. So we shouldn't take away people's ability to get experience, to work their way up. And yeah, let's make sure they get a raise, and they can do that by starting at the bottom and getting experience and working their way up.
It seems as though the administration hasn't taken a lot of care to look more deeply beyond bumper sticker solutions to any of these issues. You have to wonder with the new Biden Department of Labor, whether anyone is actually doing economic research. I understand now that Bernie Sanders Senator Sanders is on the Finance Committee for the United States Senate. Where do you think that's going to go when it comes to labor issues?
Oh, Bernie Sanders has been pretty explicit of what his views on labor and unions are. One of the scariest things that he said that he's very much in support of, and unfortunately so has President Biden, and so has many Democrats, including influential Democrats on the House Ed and Workforce, or Ed, excuse me, Ed and Labor Committee, is a thing called sectoral bargaining. Essentially, what these academics and what these politicians are trying to do is they're saying that they're looking at Europe and saying that, well, they have this one size fits all collective bargaining. I don't mean from company to company, but essentially allowing unions to set wages and benefits via wage and benefit boards for entire industries. Essentially organize entire industries, not organize company to company. So, just to kind of illustrate it, one way it may work is that Volkswagen workers in the South that have consistently said no to the UAW could be forced under UAW representation or UAW wages and benefits, because the UAW would be de facto the union for all auto workers across the country, not just the big three in the Midwest.
We keep hearing about workers' rights, and this administration wants to do this and that for workers, when it seems to me it's more about what they're doing to workers. Do you think that the average American family is going to end up being forced to pay more taxes for this administration's programs? Is it going to?
You just look at what President Biden has been saying. He's saying that he wants to raise taxes. So I would, it seems like just looking at least what he was promising, that we do need to be prepared to unfortunately pay more.
We keep hearing that workers are saying they're paying dues and getting nothing in return for it. They should have a way of pressuring the unions to A, do more for the dues that they're getting, and B, if they're giving contributions to political candidates, it should reflect the will of the worker, not just the union bosses. The problem seems to be growing too with federal workers. What's the status now of decisions like Janus under the Biden administration?
Well, Janus was all public employees. So mostly what we're focused on here is state employees. So for state employees, state and local public sector workers, the Janus decision was basically twofold. The first part of the Janus decision was right to work. It said that all public employees have a First Amendment right to choose whether or not to pay a union. It said that everything that government unions do is inherently political, and because it's political, public employees should be able to choose, yes, I want to pay the union, or no, I don't. Long and short of it is, this is right to work, and it brought right to work to many states where unions could actually get workers fired for not paying them. Now, thankfully, public sector workers in California, New York, New Jersey, Illinois, and several other states that did not have that protection do now. But Justice Alito actually went further, and in the second part of the decision said that in order to have dues collected from these public employees, there has to be what he said, evidence of affirmative consent, or essentially that public employees should opt in to paying union dues. There should be evidence that should go directly to their employer, not use the union as a middleman. There should be language in whatever they sign informing them that they have a First Amendment right to choose not to pay, and making sure that they really do want to pay before money is taken from their paycheck and given to them.
We've seen over the years that unions have been basically in the Democratic side, on the Democratic side, union bosses in particular. Are you seeing any more divisions now in recent times between union bosses, union workers, and movement between the Democratic and the Republican Party?
Over the last 4 years, you absolutely saw more and more divergence between union leadership and union membership. And I think that's only going to expand now, while union leadership is directly supporting policies and politicians that are destroying union jobs. So I think that gulf between the leadership and the membership is only going to grow.
I know this is a bit far afield, but in the city of Chicago, teachers are refusing to go back to in-person teaching. Do you see this type of dispute spreading throughout the country?
I mean, it's already spreading, and even with safety standards, with questions of keeping schools closed or keeping schools open, I think parents are seeing that more and more teachers unions are getting in the way of children's education, especially with their demands. They're going further than just what's health and safety, just what is best for the teachers. They're getting into all sorts of other political issues. And I think especially what's happening in Chicago right now and what's been happening, not just during COVID, but even before, especially with these teachers unions taking more and more political stances that have nothing to do with teaching. They're showing that they're more and more political partisan organizations and less as a representative organization. But hopefully the membership will stand up and say, no, we just want you as professional representation organizations, service organizations. But as is evidenced right now in Chicago, I don't know if that's happening.
You know, Vincent, I have two children that are in college, and they talk to a lot of their friends about what their future will be like. What do you think is going to happen to our next generation of workers that are going to be entering the workforce in the next couple of years? Is there hope for the future, or are we going to say that this next generation just will not be able to do as well as their parents?
Hopefully they will be able to do as well. And what we are seeing, and once again, the hope is that the Biden administration will not quash a lot of independent work and entrepreneurship that you do see popping up, whether it's with the gig economy, whether it's with independent contractors, with people that do want the freedom and flexibility to work for themselves. I mean, that's the brave new future. And that was what the Department of Labor really helped emphasize in their recent rulemaking. That we'll see what happens if the Biden administration tries to stop it. But that is where I would see a lot of the future going, with people working for themselves, thinking outside the box, even working from home. And now with Zoom, like we're doing right now, and especially things that have kind of solidified even during the pandemic. When we do get to that new normal, I think a lot of the changes that have happened today are going to stick, and that's going to be the future if government doesn't get in the way.
And that, of course, is the ultimate question. Vincent Vernuccio, thank you very much for being on the program.
Hey, thanks for having me.
If you look at the scope of what this administration has done in just a couple of days, really, just a couple of weeks, I don't think any other administration within the first month of office established a policy that puts so many people out of work so quickly.
You're very correct, and I think we already have our next guests lined up.
Judge John Wilson served on the bench in New York City and then also served as a prosecutor on an Indian reservation in North Dakota. And most importantly, he's a prolific author at usagovpolicy.com. John, welcome back.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here with you.
John, over the past couple of days, we've seen an explosion of executive orders. Now, I think constitutionally, executive orders were perhaps perceived to be something that had to be done relatively easily or quickly, but not to replace actual legislation. It does seem that increasingly the executive branch has depended more on executive orders than legislation. Do you see this as more of a trend going forward?
I consider this a dangerous trend going forward. If you look at the history of executive orders prior to the Biden administration, you had somewhere in the area of 4 orders from President Trump when he first took office, maybe 3 orders from President Obama, who was at least as aggressively progressive as the Biden administration is placing itself to be. And if you go back to George Bush, you have no executive orders whatsoever. So to begin legislating through the executive powers is a dangerous precedent to be setting now. It cuts Congress out of the conversation entirely. And if anybody should be concerned about this, it's the congressmen. They're the ones who normally would be looking at these issues and setting the laws, not the executive branch.
I want to tie this into another issue. During the Obama administration, the Paris Climate Accord was signed onto by President Obama. He also signed on to the JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran. In essence, both of these far-ranging and significant pieces of foreign affairs were treaties. Yet Barack Obama never bothered to take these to the United States Senate for advised consent, ratification, or denial. President Trump, of course, didn't go along with either one and essentially ditched both of them. President Biden now is saying he's signing on to the Paris Climate Accord and is going back to the Iran nuclear deal. Doesn't this cut out the entire constitutional role of the United States Senate when it comes to foreign affairs?
Absolutely, it does. The power of advice and consent is in the Constitution, mandated to the Congress. The president may be able to negotiate a treaty. And what is the Paris Climate Accord other than a treaty? Is there some other definition that we can give it other than a treaty? I don't believe so. I would call it a fraud, by the way, given the fact that the Paris Climate Accord would not reduce greenhouse gases by any significant measure. And even John Kerry admits that. So, but to cut out the Congress, just as is being done with the executive orders, this is a very big threat to our republic right now. You have an executive branch that's seizing power and cutting out the representatives of the rest of the people.
You know, John, I'm just wondering what you think about this. President Biden, and he is now in office, has said that he is going to be a uniter, that he's going to work across the aisle, that he's going to heal the nation. You're out in the middle of the country. Frank and I are on the East Coast. What are you hearing? Do you feel that and I'm using the word feel because liberals love that word. It's not think, it's how they feel about things. How do you feel about this? Do you feel that this administration is going to be one that can unite the people, or is it going to be something terrible?
No, it's been very apparent from the beginning that Biden's attempts to use the rhetoric of unity has been nothing more than another fraud. He and the Democratic Party have absolutely no intention of uniting with Republicans, unless, of course, there are Republicans who decide that they want to follow along with whatever the Democrats want done. See, that's the real definition of unity when you speak with this administration. Do what we tell you to do, and then you're unified with us in what we want done. So no, I don't think the Biden administration was ever serious about unification. I think they just talked that rhetoric to take in foolish Republicans like Mitt Romney's, who would believe that there's some ability to work with the Biden administration. There isn't.
You know, it's fascinating. One of the main topics of discussion, both in academia and in the media, is why have we become so divided as a nation? And I would venture to say that what united the nation in the past was a mutual respect from all parties for the basic documents of our nation, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution. As the years have gone by, and academia in particular has become far more to the left, and they have now produced the reporters and the elected officials who no longer have faith in concepts like the Bill of Rights or the constitutional order of things. Do you see, as someone who's been on the bench, who's been a judge, who's enforced the law, who's fought in the law, that this lack of respect for the basic foundational documents of our nation is indeed the cause for our disunity?
Yes, and what's even more of a problem is that left-wing contingent that you're talking about in particular have been the academics and the teachers, and have for several generations now been indoctrinating our youth in disrespect for the founding documents of our country. You can't have a unified country if we can't agree on what the basic principles of our republic are. And for many years now, we've had academics who are teaching our children that our unifying documents are nothing but expressions of white supremacism and racism and other such rhetoric of that nature, rather than making our students understand that these documents, while they may have been written by flawed human beings, some who were slaveholders, some who had negative histories, the ideals behind those documents live beyond the lifetimes of those persons and the wrongs that they did. Those documents establish a framework where every American has an equal opportunity to succeed, to work together. And that's been forgotten by a generation that's never been taught it. They have teachers who are teaching them the exact opposite. You can't have a unified republic if we're going to have division right at the beginning of our educational system.
You recently wrote a series of articles for usagovpolicy.com, which you talked about the teaching of American history and how that's declined. Tell us a bit about the article.
The problem is the communist influence, the Marxist influence in the education system today. You have, at one point, you had the labor unions in the early part of the 20th century. The labor unions were heavily influenced by communists. And at one point, the labor unions had to expel the more communist unions that were out there. Today, we have that same problem with the teachers union. The teachers unions have become nothing more than communist fronts. And I'm not talking about every teachers union, of course, but if you look at the perspective, if you look at the statements of most of the major teachers unions, they follow along with communist ideology and communist philosophy. And this is a major problem for our country today.
I venture to say that some of our friends on the left who just heard the previous comments have had the hair on the back of their head stand up and about yelling, screaming and yelling, how dare he say something along those lines? You know, it is fascinating that our academic institutions have now decided that free speech and open expression is a horrible idea. You know, we see in the latest example, one university decided to proclaim that that blue police flag, you know, the American flag with a blue line in it, is an expression of white supremacy. Bad enough. Not only did they tell students that they can't say anything against that ridiculous policy, but they are now saying that students must affirmatively say they agree with the policy under the usual pains of being, you know, tossed out of school or being somehow harassed. This has gone, I think, a step farther than we've ever seen before. Each year, it seems the repression of free speech gets worse and worse and worse. That attitude, which began on college campuses, now seems to become the basic culture of the country as a whole.
These leftists are the same ones who complained back in the 1950s when loyalty oaths were being required. They all had a very stern objection to having to make a loyalty oath. Now they have a requirement of loyalty oaths to the left-wing principles, and of course that's different. They can make those statements. There's only one solution to this problem, one viable solution, and that is more and more students and more persons who are subject to these ridiculous rules have to bring litigation. There are public service groups that are interested in pursuing cases like this and have had success in bringing litigation and claims like this. More people have to go resort to the courts and enforce their rights. That's the only way anything like this, these oversteps, are ever going to be corrected.
You know, John, I've heard a lot of parents complaining about the curriculum that the children receive in K to 12. The average American parent is not in favor of this extremism, the progressive agenda. Can you tell us from a legal point of view, before it goes to a court, what can a parent do in a local school system to influence the agenda? Say, do they have any rights to change what their children are learning?
It's hard to put it as having a right, but I think they do have some input on what their children are learning. The school sets the curriculum, but if the curriculum is detrimental to the child's welfare, which an anti-American curriculum would be detrimental to any American child's welfare, any objective view, I think, would be in that area, then the first step a parent can take is notifying the school that this is their objection. I understand perfectly how some parents would be afraid to do that. This cancel culture has just gotten so out of control that people are very afraid to speak up. If you're that afraid to speak up, maybe you want to speak with other parents and gauge what their feelings are. And then a group of the parents can put a letter together to express their concerns with the board. When the board tells them to go jump in a lake, as I would assume they're going to do, that's when they pursue litigation. And in any such letter, there's no harm in letting the board know that you'll be exploring that as an option. But laying it out in a letter to the school is probably a good first step. And trying to find other parents who would agree with you on this issue so that you can work in a united fashion is probably another good step as well.
And perhaps putting it in an open letter to your local town paper as well would not be a bad idea. Speaking of town papers, we're seeing more and more that editors are telling writers on the conservative side that they're getting letters from readers saying, how come you can print a conservative in your newspaper? That shouldn't be done. Have we gone so far away from the concept of the First Amendment that we just don't seem to have that in our popular culture anymore?
Yes, I mean, we discussed that earlier. It's the educational factor. Students aren't being taught what the nature of the First Amendment really is. Instead, teachers are now emphasizing to students that if they feel offended by something, that's when they should be speaking out and try to silence the people that are offending them. The First Amendment didn't guarantee your right not to be offended. It guarantees your right to speak out. In fact, the concept of the First Amendment is that some of your speech is going to be offensive. But from speech that you don't agree with, the speech that you do agree with, usually you can forge a compromise to something that can be moved forward. That compromise is no longer possible if you have a group of people who were never educated in that art of compromise.
Indeed, wasn't the essence of the First Amendment that it's offensive speech that really brings about progress? I'm sure we offended King George III early on. I'm sure we offended the slaveholders of the South when we talked about abolition. And I'm sure we offended a heck of a lot of people when we talk about giving women the vote. It seems that that has been entirely missing from our academic curriculum.
And that's going right back to what Daria said earlier. It's all concerned about feelings, not thought. The First Amendment was intended to foster free thought. And if some of that free thought hurts somebody's feelings, well, then that person had to express what their thought was. And maybe it would hurt the feelings of the other person who disagreed with them. Hurt feelings were always part and parcel of this process. Now it's become the be all and end all of avoidance. We don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. That's the core of the problem.
Do you think, John, that this has been, in a sense, and I don't want to be going overboard with this word, but programmed over the years? Because it seems to me that, some people use the term as slippery slide to socialism. There's all different terms, but it seems to me that this is a very organized effort. We saw the removal in many school systems of political clubs that were Republican and Democrat and replaced by a single political club. It's like, the communist state in China has one political party. Now we see in our high schools, because of the desire of many of the school systems administrators to get rid of conflict, they put all kids together. Have we lost our ability to handle conflict, to be able to debate, to have the skill sets that make us free and make us American?
Yes. Think about the academics that we're talking about. This all began right around the time of the 1960s. And the radical students who participated in all those marches and all those movements of the 60s moved into academia. Those academics then have been teaching for at least 3 generations. And their students have moved on into academia. So you have this snowball effect. We always discussed 3-4 generations of poverty, and you'd have a family that had been on welfare one generation after another generation after another generation, never moving forward. This is the same in academia. You have academics who are spawning other left-wing academics who have spawned more left-wing academics to the point now where they hold the power in academia. And as a result, they're the ones controlling all the issues that are presented to the students. You have a certain segment of the student body that's going to resist this indoctrination, but most people don't have that ability and that strength. And many people are just not political and don't think in these terms. And so they absorb these concepts, these left-wing communist concepts, and somehow think that this is the right way to think, not understanding how it's anathema to our constitutional method of government.
Attorney General Ken Paxton of Texas has filed a lawsuit against Google on its monopoly basis. Certainly, there's a feeling on the part of the American people that Google and Facebook have monopolized political thought as well. John, if you, after this interview, decided to get on an airplane and come back and visit us in New York, the airline could not say to you, we don't like your political views. We just heard you on the Vernuncio Novak report, and we're not going to let you on our plane. The theory that a number of folks are suggesting, and I mentioned this in a Washington Times article several years ago, that Google and Facebook are common carriers of ideas, and that while the government cannot tell them what to publish, that they should be treated the same way an airline or a railroad should, in that they are common carriers of ideas. And as long as they advertise as being open to the public, they should indeed be open to the public without censorship. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, let's look at this in a slightly different way. That's one good argument moving forward. The one that I keep hearing from the left is that Google, Facebook, Twitter, these are private companies, and private companies are not subject to constitutional restrictions, can pretty much do whatever they want. That's demonstrably false. Let's take real estate. Private companies own real estate all across the nation. They own apartment buildings. They own commercial properties all across the country. Are those companies allowed to discriminate in who they lease their property to? No, they are not. Why? Because that is detrimental to our American way of life, to our constitutional system. So if I own private real estate and I discriminate against who I rent that real estate to, I'm in violation of the law. Google, Facebook, Twitter, they're violating the rights of people on the right. They're censoring them. Why wouldn't you apply the same analysis to them? Just the fact that they're a private company doesn't stop them from having some constitutional controls over their behavior.
And indeed, if you want to look at a very recent example, when a baker decided he did not want to bake a marriage cake for a gay marriage, the law came down on him fairly hard. Wouldn't that same legal concept apply to Google and Facebook when they blank out conservative authors?
I would think so, and the same. Parler is the company that we're thinking of most, and Parler had a right to its expression. If some of that expression was offensive, then some of that expression was offensive. Another deeper issue is the claim against Parler is, well, they were fostering violent speech. Well, how on earth was Twitter and Google and Facebook not sponsoring the same violent speech? For instance, when that comedian Kathy Griffin was holding up a severed head of Donald Trump. That's not violent speech. Somehow that was permissible on Facebook, allowing a discussion of the assassination of a president of the United States, but discussing the possibility that the election may not have been fairly run, that suddenly was violent speech.
And indeed, Facebook and Twitter, I believe, also had articles, inserts about people who wanted to do terrible things to the son of the president. And that was apparently okay by them, but not allowing a discussion. Daria.
Here's something that just happened very recently. There was a video found of the new deputy spokeswoman at the State Department saying the greatest threat to this country is now from police officers. This was a post that she had put up on Facebook, actually, from a while ago. When we have an administration that are calling those who are putting their lives on the line to protect Americans as the greatest threat to this country, how can we change things? Are we due for 4 years of this sort of upside down government? Is there anything we can do as American citizens peacefully to improve things?
Hey, let me just add something to that before you answer, John. In the opening days of the Obama administration, his department, I believe, of Homeland Security, said that returning veterans from the Iraqi wars were the greatest threat to national security.
Yeah, I remember that. What can we do about it? Do you remember Van Jones?
Oh, indeed.
Well, he was official with the Obama administration, and I think it was Glenn Beck who revealed for everyone to see that he was pretty much a communist, that he stated that Mao Zedong was one of his great influences in his life, and had other sort of comments supporting communist philosophy. He ended up being hounded out of office. Probably the best thing we can do is keep pointing to the examples of this sort of inappropriate statements from persons who then are in authority to act upon their inappropriate behavior. I understand that official, Daria, that you talked about, made an apology and claimed that she was just upset about some police violence that she had either witnessed or in general. But there are other officials in the Biden administration who are very questionable in their thought process. And the only way that we can possibly root them out is to continue to expose their ideology that is not constitutional in its basis.
Yeah. Add to that, the recently appointed head of Homeland Security, a fellow now by the name of Alejandro Mayorkas, is known to have sold green cards to Chinese nationals who contributed to the Democratic Party. You know, it seems as though we've entered an era where the regulations and the laws don't seem to apply to the left.
This is probably one of the most corrupt administrations we're ever going to be saddled with. You had hard evidence before the election that was suppressed regarding the president's son, Hunter Biden, and his involvement with China. Those allegations implicated the president directly, and yet all of that evidence was ignored. If this isn't one of the most corrupt administrations since the Ulysses Grant administration, I don't know what is.
Hey, at least Ulysses Grant won a war and freed the slaves.
That's true enough, but he was also known for being extremely trusting of his friends and let them run roughshod all over government. The scandals involved in the Grant administration are legendary. Unfortunately, I think we can expect the same from the Biden administration.
Yeah, for those who are currently in college, Ulysses S. Grant was a great general for the Union Army during the Civil War. I guess you won't hear that in your history classes these days.
Well,
Hey, John, go ahead. Sorry.
I've got to mention this. If you look at some of the schools today through K to 12, they're saying that the history of this country starts after 1865, after the Civil War. You have others that are saying, back in the 1600s, trying to attribute it to slavery or the slaves coming in. We have such a mix-up in our school system right now. John, I don't even know what we need to do first. There are so many issues right now.
I have a recommendation for all the viewers. This is something I followed myself. I find that as the time goes on, the school books are less and less full of information and history. They're just full of political rhetoric now. If you really want to educate yourself on American history, buy old textbooks. You may not agree with the philosophy of some of the older presentations, but you'll hear facts that aren't presented anymore. I happened to go to a used bookstore and found a textbook on American history from the 1870s. And it described early American conflicts, such as Prince Philip's War. Who even heard of Prince Philip and know what that war was all about? That's one of the early American Indian and settler conflicts in the Northeast. So these are incidents that aren't taught anymore. You can find them. You can educate yourself. We still have that freedom, and I really encourage you, the viewers and the listeners, educate yourself by going to used bookstores, go online, find this information for yourself.
Great words, John. John, we look forward to our next discussion.
I always do. This is a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, John. And to our audience, thank you for tuning in.
We welcome our newest radio affiliate, Net Talk America in Washington, D.C. at 96.7 FM. We're broadcast throughout the United States on radio and television and worldwide on the web. Watch us on Roku, public broadcast stations, and on the AM/FM 247.com network. You can access the program anytime on our website at usagovpolicy.com. Join us again next week. We're sponsored by the New York Analysis of Policy and Government, a division of the American Analysis of News and Media, Inc. at usagovpolicy.com, and the Institute for American Politics. Email us at truthinradio@gmail.com.
Our producer is the amazing Abigail White, and our director is the brilliant Jeff Hansen.